a budget that delivers a stronger economy for the British people, investing in public services, levelling up, delivering on growth and jobs, with a pay rise for 7 million people, 5 million in the public sector and 2 million through an increase in the national living wage. Today, I will very briefly summarise some of the headline announcements we've made on the budget already, with the caveat that the bulk of the detail of the budget, of course, will be delivered by the Chancellor himself at this dispatch box tomorrow. And importantly, that includes all market-sensitive information. Part of the government's objective in trailing specific aspects of the budget in advance is to help communicate to the public what we're doing with their hard-earned money, because we believe there is merit in clear and accurate information. Let me turn very briefly to just a few of the measures we have announced. An increase in the national living wage from £8.91 to £9.50 an hour, meaning an extra £1,000 a year for a full-time worker. £3 billion worth of investment to build a high-wage, high-skill economy with a doubling of investment in 16 to 19-year-olds and a quadrupling of the number of skills boot camps. A multi-billion-pound overhaul of local transport to help level up communities across England, with transport settlements for city regions increased to £5.7 billion and allocated directly to cities. And as part of the spending review, a £5.9 billion deal for the NHS to tackle the backlog of non-emergency procedures and modernise digital technology, with at least 100 community diagnostic centres to help clear most test backlogs by the end of this Parliament. These are just a few of the measures that the Chancellor will outline tomorrow to this House as the government continues its work of delivering a stronger economy for the British people.
Can I now come to Shadow Minister Bridget Phillips?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question. Mr. Speaker, we face an urgent cost of living crisis. Prices are up in our shops, at our petrol pumps and on our heating bills. Families and businesses are waiting and hoping for the Chancellor to take the action that they need and which our country desperately needs. But the Chancellor hasn't even delivered his budget yet, and it's already falling apart. In recent days, we have read thousands of words about what the Chancellor plans to do, but the silence is deafening on the soaring bills and rising prices facing families and businesses. So today I ask the Minister 5 things, and I ask him to answer them clearly and simply, not in press releases, but to this House. First, will he justify properly withholding from Parliament decisions that he and his colleagues have given to the press? Second, he just stood there and said that he believes in clear and accurate information. So on that basis, will he confirm that he understands that for a full-time worker on the minimum wage in receipt of universal credit, a rise to £9.50 an hour will place far less than an extra £1,000 in their pocket? Third, will he confirm that the public sector pay rises ministers told newspapers about yesterday will be real terms pay rises, as his ministerial colleague was unable to do so on the telly this morning? Fourth, will he follow Labour's lead and confirm today, now that he's with us, that he will be cutting VAT on domestic heating bills to zero for 6 months? And finally, will he back Britain's high street firms, freeze business rates now and replace them with a better system fast? He can tell the newspapers it's time for him to tell this House.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And obviously, it's very important that we consider all the measures that have been trailed in the round. What I would say is clearly that the wider announcements that have been made are entirely accurate. So the national living wage is rising by £1,000 a year. That takes the benefit for a full-time worker on the national living wage since 2016 to £5,000. That's a substantial increase. I think it beggars belief that the Labour Party stands here saying that a 6.6% increase in the national living wage somehow isn't enough, and it needs to be considered in conjunction with all the other announcements that have been made, including a £500 million household support fund, including the energy price cap, including all the action that we've taken to freeze fuel duty to keep bills low. We are acutely conscious of the pressures that face households, and that is something that we take action to modify. On public sector pay, the Honourable Lady asked about that. Well, we will be returning, and I'm delighted, to the normal processes that adjust for public sector pay in light of all the pressures that exist, and that will be for the relevant pay review bodies to discuss in conjunction with government in the normal way. I'm not going to preempt that work, but we will be working closely with them to make sure that what is announced is right, and the Chancellor will have further details on this in his speech. When it comes to the cost of energy, we have the energy price cap, which is protecting households with up to £100 a year off their bills. That's the right thing to do. I think it's something which we all recognise as a priority for all of our constituents. And when it comes to business rates, we'll be having the upshot of the review that's been conducted, the fundamental review of how we can get the future of this right. The Labour Party have committed to abolishing business rates, and they've done so without any clear idea how they would fund that. Indeed, the disconnect between what the Labour Party has committed to and what they've actually funded is somewhere in the region of 400 billion committed to, with 5 billion of savings to pay for it. Now, that is not a responsible way to run the economy. What you will be hearing from this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow is a clear plan to make sure that we can balance the books, but also to take our economy forward in a way which works for the benefit of all our communities. And that obviously is the priority of my right honourable friend the Chancellor and myself.
Sir John Redmond.
Mr. Speaker, this is not the first government that's wanted more than one day's news out of a budget, but the right way to do it is all ministers observe complete budget secrecy. The Chancellor announces the tax changes and the block totals on spending, and then in the days that follow, Cabinet ministers come to this House to announce the detailed spending plans and subject them to our scrutiny. If that was right for all previous governments, why isn't it right for this one?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question, and actually I completely share with him his assessment of the importance of this House, and that is something which both the Chancellor and I are acutely aware of. In 2013, the then Chancellor, George Osborne, asked the Permanent Secretary for HMT to conduct a review into the practice of the release of budget information under embargo on Budget Day, and he set out a series of recommendations. His central conclusion was that the Treasury should introduce a ban on the pre-release of the core of the budget, that is to say, the economic and fiscal projections, the fiscal judgment, and individual tax rates, reliefs, and allowances. We have observed that stricture in full, and that is something which I'm obviously totally committed to continuing to do.
Matter of judgment. SNP spokesperson Nelson Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't know whether to congratulate the Minister on his promotion for coming here to give us the budget a day early, but what he has not given us in this House is an apology. He shouldn't be announcing things on Twitter. We should be waiting for the budget to see the full detail. And this has been going on, Mr. Speaker, since September. This is not new. This has been daily announcements, drip-feeding the entire budget ahead of time. And of course, the government holds all the cards on this, along with the OBR, because we can't tell what that detail actually means. And for Scotland, we cannot tell what the Barnett consequentials, if indeed there are any, will be. So we know what is going to be in the budget speech. We know what's not going to be in the budget speech, because the government has not done things like carbon capture and storage in Scotland. And of course, Mr. Speaker, none of this is what the government and what the Chancellor should be doing in their budget speech. They should be reinstating the £20 universal credit cut. They should be scrapping the national insurance tax on jobs. They should be tackling the spiralling cost of living crisis. And they should be supporting hospitality and tourism with a VAT cut to see them through these winter months and into next year. Mr. Speaker, if they cannot be responsible with the powers that they hold, if they cannot be trusted to give us the actual truth on Budget Day tomorrow, all of the financial powers, Mr. Speaker, I call again, should be given to the Scottish Parliament so that we can make the decisions that are right for the people of Scotland.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Lady for her remarks. I think actually that we are much stronger as one United Kingdom. Of course, it's the OECD have reaffirmed that we are expected to have the fastest growth in the G7 both this year and next, and that's something that we are achieving as one country together. She asked about the Barnett consequentials, and those will be set out very clearly in the budget tomorrow. Well, I can assure her that, of course, we consider this very closely, and we will be in a position to give good news for Scotland as part of a strong United Kingdom tomorrow. I had productive conversations with the Scottish Finance Minister, Kate Forbes, just last week about the future of the fiscal framework. I can commit, of course, I'll be speaking to her in accordance with the usual budget conventions tomorrow morning ahead of the statement.
Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure my right honourable friend would accept that the rabbit may be out of the hat. So if the Chancellor is still looking for a fluffy bunny to present on Budget Day, can I advise that we make a huge announcement about the government's Levelling Up Fund. That will be welcomed by communities across the north of England and will demonstrate our government's commitment to make sure that we level up the peoples of the north.
Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his question. He's absolutely right, of course, that levelling up is an absolutely core theme of this government. It's something which I am very proud as a North Eastern MP to have the chance to help deliver, and it is going to be one of the absolute golden threads of the Budget and Spending Review tomorrow. I wish I could start plucking rabbits out the hat for him now, but he'll have to wait just a few more hours to get some hopefully very welcome news.
Sky TV tomorrow. Dame Angela Riedel.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you also for granting this UQ. It's taken me nearly 30 years, Mr. Speaker, but I now find that I agree with the Right Honourable Member for Wokingham in his question. This is serious. As an opposition, we cannot look in detail at this slew, this blizzard of budget announcements that has been going on for week after week, because we don't have the OBR report, we don't have the detail. This is treating parliamentary democracy with utter contempt. And the Minister should be completely ashamed of himself. He should have come to this House and apologised. His boss should have come to this House and apologised.
Minister.
I thank the right honourable lady for her point. Clearly, as a former Treasury Minister herself, she would never have engaged in any activity of this kind for a budget. But the point is, there is absolutely no question of our commitment to observing all of the proprieties, reflecting the Macpherson Review, which was an internal review conducted by Sir Nicholas, the then Permanent Secretary, to work out what was sensible in advance of a budget. We have not commented on any of the substantive tax measures, and there will be a raft of full information in both the budget documents and those provided by the OBR, which obviously provides a level of detail which the last Labour government never provided in terms of its equivalent events.
Desmond Sway.
There are two sides to this coin, Mr. Speaker. The first is the government broadcasting without first letting us know. The other is the information it is trying to keep from us. Why was the leaked information on the costs, the substantial costs of Winter Plan B, marked not for publication? What is the government trying to hide? Why is it frightened of our scrutiny?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. I'm not going to comment on leaks. The absolute bottom line is that we are, of course, committed to Plan A, and there is no question that he will find that Plan A remains the resolute conviction of both this government and, indeed, I believe, this House, in terms of how we can most sensibly take the country through the winter ahead. We are not moving to Plan B. We are committed to Plan A. He should be reassured that we want to keep our economy and society open as we move through the challenges of the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been here for many years, and I've seen many budgets, and I've seen them, the order papers being waived on the day as the budget falls apart over the following hours and the following days. This is the first budget I've seen fall apart before budget day. So I wonder if the Minister could tell us. We've had an announcement about public sector pay, but what we have not heard is that public sector pay, if it's increased, will be funded, or whether it will have to come within existing budgets. Because we recall that when the government was forced to increase the pay increase for nurses from 1% to 3%, they didn't fund it. They forced it to be funded from within NHS resources. So can the Minister answer us, since we're into leaks, can we know whether the government intend to fund public sector pay?
Sure that we can move out of the shadow of the public sector pay freeze is obviously something which we're all very glad to be able to do. My right honourable friend the Chancellor will set up full details on how that will operate in his statement tomorrow.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister is one of the nice guys in Parliament and richly deserved his promotion. What he did not deserve was to be put in this position by an untenable policy. So I have to ask him the question, why is it important, right or necessary to share budget information with the media before it's shared with this House, where it can be subjected to proper scrutiny, and will he give an undertaking on behalf of the Treasury team to stop doing it?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his very kind words, and obviously we are all committed as a Treasury team and indeed as a government to making sure that this House is fully respected. That remains obviously at the core of our work. It's something which I, as a member of this House, take very seriously, and so does the Chancellor. Clearly, when we set out certain announcements, we try to provide some specific information about what it is that the government is seeking to achieve on those measures. We have respected absolutely and in full the stricture that we should not be talking about tax measures or adjustments, and that is something which I can commit we will absolutely continue to do.
Mr Speaker. Education, something that's been very much missing from the pre-announcements, and given the amount of learning that our children have lost due to COVID, I wonder if the Minister would give us another leak or pre-announcement and let us know whether the full £15 billion advocated by the Government's Education Recovery Advisor before he resigned will be allocated to education, and what support he'll be giving to the devolved nations on the same topic.
Minister.
It's obviously tremendously important we help our schools to catch up for the impact of the months of lost learning owing to the pandemic, and this is something I've seen in my own constituency as she will have in hers. The government has committed already to date £3 billion to help with education catch up, and that's something that my right honourable friend the Chancellor will be speaking more about in his statement tomorrow.
By taxpayers through Her Majesty's Treasury, the NHS Hospital Building Programme is a flagship policy and a key part of the Treasury's medium-term forecasts. Kettering General Hospital is one of those hospitals. When NHS England approve the strategic outline case for the hospital and submit those proposals to the Chief Secretary for sign-off, will he look favourably upon it, because it's a key priority for constituents in Kettering?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to speak up for the hospital in his constituency. The government has committed to 14 new hospitals and 70 hospital upgrades, and that's something which is an absolutely core part of our programme to make sure that the NHS is fit for the future. I will of course be delighted to look at the case for Kettering Hospital, as I know will ministerial colleagues across the piece, including at the Department for Health and Social Care, and I'd be delighted to have any further meetings that would be useful with him on the subject.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister said at the beginning that he respected you and he respected this House. But does he not accept that the reason we are here now in this urgent question is precisely because the opposite has happened? And while he answers that question, perhaps he can also enlighten us. Has he had discussions with the Welsh Government about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund in the way that he has with the editors of national newspapers?
Minister.
Well, I thank the right honourable lady for her question. There is absolutely no doubt that we, as I say, have observed all the proprietaries are not talking about tax measures in any of the discussions that have been had. The point I would make is I'm in regular contact with the Welsh Government. Indeed, I met with the Welsh Finance Minister last week, and I will be speaking to her again tomorrow morning ahead of budget in the usual way.
Jacob Hill.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do welcome these announcements that have been trailed ahead of the budget, but in particular this latest announcement on the national living wage. Can my right honourable friend outline how this national living wage will help my constituents and his in Teesside?
Give him a job. Just give him a job.
Minister.
Making sure that work always pays is one of the foundational principles of this government. Indeed, it's what differentiates us, frankly, from the last Labour government, where you had a series of policies which did not, I'm afraid, incentivise work, and it did indeed lead to what the then editorial Spectator, I think, termed the most expensive poverty in the world. I think that was I'm afraid, the unfortunate legacy of a series of failed policies. My right honourable friend is absolutely right in saying that the national living wage rise is the right thing to do. It's something which I'm very excited about. It continues our strong track record of making sure that our plan for jobs is matched by rising living standards.
Diolch, Mr Speaker. Much of the pre-budget announcements relate to the so-called levelling up agenda, of which the Community Renewal Fund is a key element. Considering the delay in announcing the initial successful bidders, can he press the Chancellor at this late stage to make an announcement tomorrow to extend the delivery time for those successful in the first phase?
I'll be happy to look at the honourable gentleman's recommendations, but there'll be further announcements on the Community Ownership Fund tomorrow.
Very good, Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. You may have read, Mr Speaker, in the press that the Chancellor is preparing to tell us tomorrow that the national minimum wage will be increased to £9.50 next April. But that remains way below the income that a worker can can live on. Worse still, the savage age discrimination will carry on, with young people in Middlesbrough, across Teesside and across the country having to suffer appallingly low pay. Currently, the rate for under 18s is £4.62 per hour. That's a measly increase of just 98 pence since 2010, meaning their wages have gone down in real terms. So will the government stop treating young people with such disdain, commit to scrapping the age bands and uplift the national minimum wage to £15 an hour so that all workers can live fully flourishing lives?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point, and clearly this is something he perhaps wants to take up with the leader of his own party, since I understand that was the subject of some disagreement. But what I would say is that the government is of course committed to making sure that younger workers get fair pay. We also obviously have to balance that against the wider commitment we have to making sure we don't perpetuate the very serious situation with youth unemployment that we inherited from the last Labour government. But there will be good news for younger workers in the budget tomorrow.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These decisions made by the government deeply affect people's lives. Energy bills are rocketing, inflation is up, food and petrol prices are up, furlough is ended, universal credit has been cut. It's no wonder that Citizens Advice Scotland is predicting that my constituents and others will face a really tough winter. Then they face an increase in national insurance. With this in mind, is the Chancellor really going to give his old pals in the city a tax cut in the budget tomorrow?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman will be aware that, of course, the Household Support Fund, that's £500 million, has been put in place precisely to make sure that we protect families through the course of the winter that lies ahead. And that comes on top of all the measures that we've put in place to make sure that we adjust for the cost of living. This government taxes people very fairly. We've obviously, actually, if you look at the richest 1% and 5%, they're paying more tax than they did under the last Labour government, and that, of course, includes the banks who pay their fair share as part of a wider economic settlement.
Catherine West. We're going to get
Very much, Mr. Speaker. VAT receipts have been climbing up, which is a good thing. Will the Treasury look at helping those with very high fuel bills, i.e. many children, those who have to keep their heating on during the day, those who are ill or pensioners, in order to help with this coming winter? Will he consider that as part of the package tomorrow, which of course will be announced tomorrow?
For her question, obviously the Household Support Fund is very specifically targeted to help with the cost of living. Indeed, much of it is ring-fenced for families with children, reflecting the sense of what she is saying. And the energy price cap works with that, as does the warm home discount. And the warm home discount is becoming more generous next year. It's increasing from 2.2 million people who benefit from it to 3 million people, and it's rising in value from £140 to £150. These are the kinds of measures that we will continue to look at. On VAT specifically, the Chancellor will be speaking, obviously, as part of the wider budget settlement tomorrow.
Jerome.
Mr. Speaker, 18 years ago, as Deputy General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, I was a founder member of the Drive for the Living Wage when we organised 3,000 cleaners in Canary Wharf and the City of London. I agree with what the Resolution Foundation has said, that the proposed increase does not, in their words, remotely compensate for those who will lose a £1,000 cut on the universal credit. So can I ask the Minister this? With workers facing a cost of living crisis, rising energy costs, rising inflation, rising fuel and rising food prices, is it not the case that workers' living standards will continue to be squeezed as the government gives with one hand and takes away with another?
Minister.
No, I don't accept the premise of the honourable gentleman's point. We obviously remain committed to our ambitious target of the national living wage reaching 2/3 of median earnings by the end of this Parliament and expanding it to include workers over the age of 21. We've obviously done an awful lot to help with living standards, doubling the personal tax threshold, doubling free childcare, expanding free school meals for all 5 to 7-year-olds, the new household support fund, the energy price cap, and there will be further measures announced by my right honourable friend the Chancellor tomorrow.
Sean Morrow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I suppose the attraction of delivering a budget by press release is that it bypasses this House. So when the government announces billions of pounds to level up transport in the north, I don't get to say that there's nothing in that for Newcastle, where extortionate bus fares are part of the cost of living crisis that my constituents are facing. Or when he says that the minimum wage is going up, I don't get to point out that the universal credit recipients in Newcastle will still be £800 a year worse off. So why does he think that the government shouldn't be accountable to the people of Newcastle Central?
I absolutely do believe we should be accountable to the people of Newcastle Central. It's why I'm here. It's why there'll be a 5-day budget debate over the course of the days ahead. It's why my right honourable friend the Chancellor will be in front of select committees. To her point about transport settlements, we need to unlock devolution in the northeast of England. And my number one ask of the Labour authorities in that part of the world would be to make sure that they get their act together and actually unlock a devolution settlement.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As well as knowing what the government will be doing, we also know what the government intends not to do. We know that they won't be investing in carbon capture and underground storage in Scotland, and we of course know that they will not be match funding the Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition Fund. But the Treasury has raked in some £350 billion of oil revenues over the decade. So can I ask the Minister, why is his department now turning its back on Scotland?
Minister.
Well, if we leave aside tired clichés about our attitude to Scotland, which I'm afraid is all we ever get from this side of the House, we are, of course, a government committed to the success of the whole of the United Kingdom. The budget will contain within it many things which are reflecting the major union benefits for Scotland, just as much as there are for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm a proud British citizen. I wouldn't accept the sense of what he is saying. In terms of carbon capture, utilisation and storage, the Scottish project remains the first reserve, as he will know, and obviously we are intended to take this project forward alongside, of course, a flourishing North Sea oil and gas sector as well, and offshore wind, and all the things which will go together to reflect the £30 billion worth of commitments that are made as part of our net zero strategy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for agreeing to this urgent question, because this is getting out of hand, I'm sure you'll agree. Just yesterday I was asking the Universities Minister if she would announce the decision on the Auger review and the government's response publicly in the chamber. She would not commit to that, so perhaps you could follow that one up with the Department for Education, make sure they actually do deliver it here in this chamber. We've had more announcements than you get on the Clapham Omnibus from this government in the last few days about the budget, much of it commercially sensitive. I would like to know from the Minister when those newspapers were actually given details of the announcements the government was making in the budget, and when indeed the advisory board of the Conservative Party was also made aware of some of these announcements.
Minister.
I really don't know what the honourable gentleman is implying with his question, but clearly no impropriety has occurred, and all announcements are made, as usual, through the normal Treasury and cross-government processes to make sure that announcements are released to the media.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister agree that for many who are drip-fed budget snippets from the press rather than in this House, it makes it more difficult for right honourable and honourable members to fully consider the principles without the bias slant of the media? And will the Minister be prepared to consider allowing members access to the budget the night before under strict embargo to enable consideration of the documentation rather than media presentation?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He is, of course, one of the most assiduous members of this House. Clearly, we all look to make sure that the budget documentation is as full and as frank as possible, and obviously we have the work of the independent OBR as well, to make sure precisely that the budget debate that follows can be as fully informed as possible as to the full implications of all the measures that are announced.
Can I just ask for a little clarification from the Minister? He has made an announcement today to the House, but I'm not sure he's correct. He did say it's a 5-day debate. I thought it was only 4.
My apologies, Mr Speaker. 4-day debate.
We heard it in the House first. Point of order, Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, you remember that last Wednesday at COP Questions, I asked the Minister for COP if he would meet with me to discuss the concerns of some businesses in my constituency who are having difficulty as a result of the COP restrictions that have been put in place. And the Minister committed at the dispatch box to have that meeting with me. Mr Speaker, the Minister now appears to be reneging on his promise to me in this House to have a meeting. Is there anything that you can do, Mr Speaker, to advise what I should do in these circumstances? Because the businesses in my constituency are extremely frustrated and extremely disappointed to have this response from the Minister. Now, I know and I accept that the COP Minister is busy, but if he's made a promise in this House, surely that should mean something.
Let me just say, I have great faith in the Minister, and as President of COP, I'm sure that his word is his bond, I'm sure he'll be listening to it and he'll be arranging his diary forthwith, and I'm sure the Treasury branches will just remind him of that commitment, and I would expect him to fulfil that commitment. Right, let's go to presentation of bills. Minister Greg Helms. Clerk.
Nuclear Energy Financing Bill.
Second reading what day? No. No, right. Okay. Sorry? There should be a proper date, I think. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. Thanks. Okay.
Next week.
Right, okay. Right, we now come to 10-minute rule motion. I now call Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Government and Ofgem to conduct and act on a review of the electricity transmission grid and associated charges, to include consideration of abolishing charge differentials based on geographic location, incentivising renewable energy generation to maximise energy output, and minimising the passing on of charge fluctuation risk to consumers in the form of higher prices and for connected purposes. Mr Speaker, the driver behind this bill is that Scotland currently has the highest grid charges in Europe. The Tory government, they shrug their shoulders and say it's nothing to do with us, it's a matter for Ofgem. However, they're the ones that set the rules for Ofgem to implement. What is the point about the government bragging about a net zero target of 2050 and a plan to decarbonise the electricity grid by 2035 when they do not seem capable of seeing the bigger picture? And Mr Speaker, while they probably don't care about Scotland having the highest grid charges, it fits their perception that Scotland's remote, so additional costs therefore make sense. And anyway, it's just us Scots whinging again. But the reality is that continuing as is jeopardises their own net zero plans as well as Scotland's own targets. It makes a mockery of their levelling up agenda. A levelling up agenda which in reality is just about targeting the red wall seats of North England and the Midlands. An agenda confirmed last week by a disgraceful decision to class the Scottish CCS cluster as a reserve. Now, Mr Speaker, the current grid charging system was introduced in 1992 following privatisation of the electricity market. Now, back then, it was based on the concept that electricity is generated from coal, gas, oil or large nuclear stations. And yet, with this embedded concept, then the charging system now still is geared at incentivising power generation sites close to the centres of population, or more accurately, the closer to London the better. So it's utterly absurd that the UK government is taking the welcome step to phase out coal-fired electricity generation, but they're retaining a grid charging system that is based on where to build coal-fired power stations. It is completely bonkers. Now, the obvious strategy would be to consider what a future grid will look like. Where are the best locations for the generation of clean, renewable energy? What will the grid upgrades be required to facilitate that? Then analyse what's the long-term cost of the grid upgrades, and then devise a fair system of charging to facilitate that. And that, Mr Speaker, is exactly what this bill seeks to do. Now, let's be clear, having the highest geographical charges in Europe creates an uneven playing field when looking for investment. The majority of the countries in Europe don't have locational charges. The ones that do charge way less than is imposed in Scotland. Now, Mr Speaker, if a developer built a grid-connected turbine in each of the following countries: Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Austria, France, Slovakia, Romania and Belgium, then the combined locational charges for these 9 turbines across 9 countries would be less than the charge imposed in a single turbine in the north of Scotland. That illustrates the investor competition for Scotland, let alone the fact that so many other countries, such as the Netherlands and Germany, don't impose geographical charges. And worse, the UK government are building interconnectors that allow electricity imports which are exempt from these grid charges. Now, I'm supportive of an interconnected energy market, but at the moment this system incentivises international investors to invest in other countries. Now, Scotland has 25% of Europe's offshore wind potential, so future planning should be about how to maximise this. especially when the UK government's got a 40 gigawatt target for offshore wind by 2030, which is reliant on 10 gigawatts coming from Scotland. Now, Scotland's also got fantastic potential with floating offshore wind, especially now the Highwind project is already operational. So again, forward thinking is about maximising opportunities for these leading technologies. Now, Mr Speaker, it's not just us in the SNP saying change is required. Wider industry says it too. Scottish Power, SSE, Vattenfall, RWE, Red Rock Power, Renewable UK and Scottish Renewables have all called for changes to the grid charging regime. And indeed, a survey by SSE showed that 93% of industry stakeholders support reform of the current transmission charging regime. And 84% of respondents stated that the network charging system acts as a barrier to the delivery of their renewable projects in Scotland. So what does it take for the UK government to sit up and listen?
Exactly what?
Now, what could be more iniquitous than suffering the highest grid charges in Europe? Well then, if you look within the UK energy market, Scotland's further disadvantaged, especially in comparison to southern England. Connections in the south of England results in generators being paid to connect to the grid. It's a physical impossibility to have a negative cost of managing one area of the transmission system, so therefore this appears to be another method of levelling down, not up. Then, if we look at the Beatrice array off the coast of Moray, HIP pays a unit electricity price of £4.50 to connect to the grid, but a comparator in southern England is paid £1.50 per unit of energy. Why isn't the leader of the Scottish Tories speaking up about this? And another example in numbers is that a 1 gigawatt site off the North Scottish coast will pay £38 million a year to connect to the grid. Yet the same sized offshore wind farm connecting southern England will get paid £7 million a year, a £45 million a year differential between the Scottish and English sites, which over 20 years, that's nearly £1 billion of a difference. Now, Scottish offshore wind farms are now 20% more expensive than those in English waters. And when the lowest price is winner takes all in the contracts for difference auctions, this becomes a major issue in putting investment in offshore renewable energy in Scotland at risk. That means less direct jobs, less supply chain work, and potentially hampers a just transition for the oil and gas industry. Now, these effects in the charging burden in Scottish projects can already be seen. In the 2015 auction round, Scottish projects accounted for almost 40% of the offshore wind contract awards. By the 2019 round, it was down to less than 10%. Surely this isn't an intended consequence. And worse, Mr Speaker, if nothing is done in the next few years, Scottish grid charges will be charged at a rate equivalent to 50% of the strike rate they achieve for selling their energy, making it impossible to compete with those bidding in English waters. It's madness to have production prices falling, some of the best sites in Europe, but yet a grid charging regime that's blocking the route to market. Now, by default, this means Scottish projects need to have 20% greater efficiencies or outputs compared to southern England sites to be able to compete, and then higher output equals higher charges, and so the cycle continues. Now, another point about the current charging system is price volatility. While the actual cost of maintaining and operating the grid remains stable, the prices charged to operate that vary up to 700%, demonstrating the system is not fit for purpose. As companies cannot predict these fluctuations, it's a risk factor they have to add to their project costs, and by the end of this decade, that's estimated that will cost consumers £400 million a year in wasted costs. And in terms of best use of bill payers' money, when considering the future energy mix, then we should not be spending billions of pounds on new nuclear. At £23 billion, Hinkley Point C is the most expensive power station in the world. And despite complete market failure in the nuclear sector, the UK government still wants to spend £20 billion plus in Sizewell. And worse, these nuclear sites under the current regime will get paid to connect to the grid. More further hidden subsidies for nuclear. Instead, investment should be committed to pump storage hydros such as SSE's Corrie Glass and the Cruachan Dam extension being planned by Drax. This creates renewable energy ready to be dispatched when required and at a fraction of the cost of nuclear. And an Imperial College report actually suggests this could save £700 million per year. Now, waiving tidal is also at the stage of being able to scale up. All that is needed for the next stage of scale up is some ring-fence money in the forthcoming contracts for difference auction. Now, money has been ring-fenced for floating offshore wind, so why not waive Untitled? And I urge the Minister to act urgently on this before it's too late. We can't have another Westminster decision that adversely impacts Scotland. If you look at the orbital O2 tidal generator situated off the coast of Orkney, it's already connected to the grid and working. It's got 80% UK content. It was the first vessel launched from Dundee in 40 years. Surely the UK Government wants to maximise this technology. It's clear change is required. A rounded energy policy that maps out a route to net zero. A policy that incentivises renewable energy production where it is best suited. An end to Scotland having the highest vocational grid charges in Europe, and an end to the volatility of the system operational charges. Mr Speaker, this bill seeks to do that. I would hope the UK Government sees sense, but there is an alternative, and that's Scotland having full control of its destiny.
Nothing like using every second. Well done. We now ask the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Alison Thewlis, Gavin Newlands, Patricia Gibson, Drew Henry, Deirdre Brock, David Linden, Dr Philippa Whitford, Brendan O'Hara, Carol Monaghan, Stephen Flynn and myself.
He has to come to the bar, just like him. Alan Brown. Marvellous.
Thank you very much. Electricity Grid Review Bill.
Second reading what day? 3rd of December. Well done, Alan. We now come to the Northern Ireland, and it's the Minister's Elections and Petitions of Concern Bill Programme number 2. Minister to move.
Beg to move.
Moved. The question is the programme motion number 2 as on the order paper. Any of that opinion say aye? Aye. No. Understanding order. I'm now required to put the question on the motion which we just had, so we've gone through that. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Northern Ireland Minister's Elections and Petitions of Concern Bill as amended in the Public Bill Committee to be considered.
Now.
We begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider the other selected new clause and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I now call Stephen Farry to move new clause 1. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to move new clause 1 and also speak to the other amendments in my name. At the outset, can I take the opportunity to pay tribute to Sir David Amos and pass on my condolences to his family, but also reference his own very personal connection to the bill before us today, in that he was one of the chairs of the committee stage, and true to his character, he handled the proceedings very professionally, efficiently, and with huge impartiality. And may I also say, for those MPs who are still new to this place and still swatting up on procedure, he was very generous and understanding in that regard as well. I can also welcome formally the new Minister of State to his role in the Northern Ireland office, and I'm sure we all look forward greatly to working with him over the coming months. And also to pass on thanks to the House of Commons staff, particularly the clerks on the bill, for the very rapid turnaround of amendments over the past week. The amendments in my name fall into 4 broad categories. The election or the nomination of First Minister, Deputy First Minister, reforms to the petition of concern, the operation of the Executive, and also the commencement date. So starting with the nomination and election of the First Ministers. Frankly, Mr Speaker, the current system doesn't work. The First Minister and Deputy First Minister are identical in terms of status, powers, responsibilities and duties. But that one small distinction in terms of word takes on disproportionate and indeed only symbolic importance. But it does turn our elections into the politics of fear and risks crowding out consideration of important economic, social and environmental issues during election campaigns. and it's often about keeping the other side out. And yet, in the past, the so-called victorious party has gone on to share power in the same joint office with the largest party from the other designation. There's now speculation that Sinn Féin could emerge as the largest party after the next Assembly election, and we have two unionist parties unwilling to make clear that in no circumstances they would serve as Deputy First Minister, which is hugely destabilising and is a selective application of the current rules of democracy as they stand. That could lead us into a very difficult situation after the next election. People should clearly adhere to the rules, but of course that does not preclude us from seeking support for reforms to make the system work more effectively.
Member Limey.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. I think it's just important to note at this stage, because he said it, that there will be issues that we can find agreement on, issues and amendments before us today that we cannot find agreement on. But importantly for these proceedings, does the Honourable Member agree, as we discussed at committee, that this bill fairly reflects what was agreed at NDNA? And unless and until we get joint agreement on a range of issues through another forum, we shouldn't be tinkering around with too many amendments this afternoon.
Well, I'm grateful to the member for his comments. I agree with him partially that this does accurately reflect the New Tech 8 New Approach agreement. But it is worth referencing that was made back in January of 2020, and I pay tribute to the former Secretary of State in that regard for his endeavours in that particular regard. However, we've had a lot of political developments since then. One of my great frustrations as a member of this place and previously a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly is that we often respond to the last crisis and fix the rules to address what has already happened, rather than actually trying to look ahead and anticipate where crises are likely to happen and put in place measures that will make the world operate a lot easier. Which brings me to new clause 1 in my name, which does seek to address some anomalies around the current system. A president of the largest party, regardless of designation, is entitled to First Minister, but then the Deputy First Minister must come from the largest